everybody to keep, okay, recording.
Okay.
I'd like to ask everybody to keep their questions after the talk and to better to write them than to pronounce. Just everybody will be able to understand them from the first time. Well, and
Okay.
Yeah, you may start. We are happy to listen.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you very much to Natalia for organizing this and anybody else involved in organizing it. I'm going to be talking about a project that we call Umbrella, Understanding Monsoons and Biodiversity Relevant to Landscapes and Livelihoods in Asia. Now, this was originally a UK-China initiative funded from both countries, but Asia is a big country or a big region. And so inevitably we have expanded to include expertise, not only from different centers within China, which include Sichuanbana Tropical Botanical Garden, where I am a visiting professor, but also Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou, the Institute of Tibetan Plateau Research in Beijing, and we have expanded beyond. So Sun Yat-sen works with Russians, and I work with people in Russia. We collaborate with people in India, and even visiting people to XTPG from France, etc. So it's a big team with a variety of different kinds of expertise. And we try and bring all this expertise together to focus on understanding how Earth's third pole has influenced the Earth system. And today I'm going to talk about how plant fossils in particular have changed how our understanding of this region. Now, numerous papers use the phrase the uplift of the Tibetan plateau. And what they're doing is they're often conflating the plateau itself with the Himalaya, the Karakoram Mountains and the Hengduan Mountains. And these collectively are termed Earth's third pole, because they influence the global climate system. So I'm going to examine the structure and assembly of this region and ideas of how it became Earth's highest and youngest topographic feature. We're going to use isotope data and recently discovered fossils to quantify, in particular, the Paleogene topography and climate of the Tibetan region, because it's the Paleogene that sees the biggest changes. And we're going to look at evidence for monsoon influences over parts of Asia going much further back in time, in fact, going back to at least 150 million years. And we're going to examine the origins of today's exceptional Asian biodiversity. Asia contains several of the world's major biodiversity hotspots. So there's a large number of endemics and endemics under threat, and really just a very large number of taxa spread across the Asian region. So there we have the plateau and the Himalaya looking at from space. And you can see immediately that the plateau there is in sharp focus, whereas India off to the left is under another 5 kilometers of atmosphere. And so it appears much murkier. The general area where we're going to be working today has an elevation between 4,000 and 5,000 meters above sea level. Now, as I said earlier, the third pole encompasses the Himalaya, the Hengduan Mountains, and the Karakorams, and you can see where they are on the map there. And the northern and western boundaries of the plateau itself are quite sharply marked by the Ailanthus fault and the Karakoram fault. To the south, we have the Himalaya, and to the east, we have the Hengduan Mountains, where there is no sharp boundary. The Hengduan Mountains slope off down into Yunnan. Now, when we look at the Tibetan region like that. It looks a fairly homogeneous piece of topography. And when geophysicists first started looking at this, they treated the whole region as a whole. And in fact, they treated the crust as plastic, a sort of soft Tibet. And what you see in this cartoon here is the crust, the mantle lithosphere and the asthenosphere as a sort of layer cake of plastic being compressed laterally. The compression is from India pressing against Eurasia. This thickens the crust, in particular the mantle lithosphere, which projects down into the hotter asthenosphere and eventually thermally erodes and falls away. And this leads to a rebound of the surface. Now, this is a geophysical model, and it was first invoked to explain an apparent sudden uplift of the plateau around 10 million years ago. I say apparent because the paleoaltimetry data was very sparse indeed, and a lot of it was inferred. But a few years later, Wang et al. Objected to this model and said, well, you can't just treat Tibet like a piece of plasticine. It has a lot of deep geological structures in it. And so they came up with an idea which essentially sees, as India pushes in, Tibet builds progressively from the south towards the northeast. So the northeastern part of the region is the youngest. They say very little about the age of the Himalaya. But when people started looking more at isotopes, the fractionation of isotopes, I'll come on to that in a moment, across the Tibetan region, they thought they saw this kind of pattern repeated in the isotope. So an uplift in the south progressing towards the northeast. And in this particular map that was published in Nature, it seems to imply that the Himalaya were part of this region which was uplifted 40 million years ago. And it ignores a major suture or structure within this area called the Yarlong Sangpo suture. And this marks the boundary between the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate. Somewhat later, 2014, Wang Airtel proposed a different model altogether. And they, based on oxygen isotope data primarily, they argued for a central core of the Tibetan region being high in the Eocene, and then growing north here and south to the Himalaya progressively during primarily the Neogene. So we have a Neogene uplift of the north and a Neogene uplift to the south. So Tibet is spreading outwards. Well, let's go back and look and see if it is, first of all, valid to treat the plateau as a single entity. Well, what we actually see when we look in the modern topography are these ghosts of deep geological structures. So I've just referred to the Yarlong Sangpo suture that runs through here, but also we can see in central Tibet another ghost of a structure running through here, and also several to the north. And when we look at the geology in detail, we find that these are suture zones or junctions between different tectonic blocks or terrains. And this was actually known in the 1980s, but largely ignored by the geophysicists and others. So we have these different suture zones separating different tectonic blocks. Today, I'm going to focus on the central one, which is the Bangong Newjang suture zone that separates these two blocks, and also the Yarlong Sangpo suture, which I've just mentioned. So let's look at those blocks now. This northern one, called the Kunlun Chaidam terrain, that's less well explored than the others. But here we have the Hoxil and Songpangangsi terrain. And we think that this originally belonged to Gondwana, moved north and collided with Eurasia sometime in the end Permian Triassic time. The Changtang terrain collided with the Hoxil terrain in the early Jurassic. The Lhasa terrain collided with the Changtang terrain in the late Jurassic, early Cretaceous. And of course, India arrived sometime early in the Cenozoic. Each of these sutures marks a junction where something is going on at depth. We're familiar with India subducting beneath the Lhasa terrain, but also the Lhasa terrain subducted beneath the Changtang terrain and so on. And each one of these collision events builds mountains and also creates foreland basins. The modern foreland basin for the Himalaya is in the Ganges plain here. And these accumulate sediments. And the sediments give us a record of what happened during these different events. So let's have a look. This is one of our drone pictures of the Yarlong Sangpo River here. And to the north, we have the Gangdesi, and here we have India. So let's just color that up. Here we have the Indian plate. It's diving beneath the Eurasian plate along this Yarlong Sangpo suture, where basically marked by the river today. And to the north, we have the old Gangdesi mountains on the southern margin of the Lhasa terrain. So again, let's look at this package of accreted terrains that make up the Tibetan region. And today, this, as I said, occupies a very significant place in global topography because both of its size and its elevation. And its size and elevation diverts the flow of major air streams. So here in blue, we have the predominant westerlies, which apply throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And these are obviously deflected by this lump of rock that sits in the way. Cold air in the winter coming down from central Eurasia and Siberia, that's also deflected around the northern part of the Tibetan region. And this also functions as both a heat source and a heat sink. It's a heat source in the summer when it heats up more than the surrounding area does and draws air in. And in the winter, the airflow is reversed and we have cold, dense air flowing off the plateau. This is the conventional view of how this part of the world amplifies and changes the Asian monsoon system. Now, these yellow and red arrows here, these are very important in delivering moisture to not only India, but across Eastern China, Eastern Asia. So the Umbrella Project is aiming to understand how this system evolved throughout the Cenozoic. And what you see in the red dots there, these are just some of the, well, in fact, they're the sites where we have looked at and studied plant megafossils across the region. You'll see some in India provide baseline studies for our paleoaltimetry. Some on the plateau itself help us understand the climate and changes in elevation over time across there. And what we have down here are more complex, but the South China sites provide us with a very good insight into the diversity of Cenozoic plants that, as I will talk about later, provide, as it were, an inoculum or a seed bank for what goes on in the rest of Asia throughout the Cenozoic. So I'm going to first of all concentrate on this Himalayan and Tibetan Plateau region. Here you can see a cross section showing the relative elevation today of this system. And there's the Yarlong Sangpo suture that we just looked at in the field. What's crucial and underlies all of the elements that we're going to look at, biodiversity, climate, etc., is understanding how the topography across this region grew through time. Now, if we're going to understand the topography, we have to be able to measure past surface height. And there are a variety of different ways in which we can do this. One that's been used the longest is using thermal lapse rates. Basically, as you go uphill, the temperature declines. And this relationship is well known in the modern world. And we have a thing called the global mean free air lapse rate, which is around 4.6 degrees C per kilometer elevation. Unfortunately, plants do not live suspended in a column of free air. They're attached to the surface, as you can see in the background. And so what we really need to do is look at how temperature changes along the Earth's surface as you go up a slope. And this is called a terrestrial lapse rate. Now, this somewhat complicated diagram below is called a Taylor diagram. And what all these points here represent are different modeling scenarios where what we're trying to do is understand how we can reconstruct a topography that we have in a climate model using dry bulb, that's normally measured temperature, terrestrial lapse rates. And the different colors represent different seasons. So summer, winter, autumn, etc. Now, in this diagram, this is our reference point. This is how if we can get close to this red star, this is a measure of how good our terrestrial lapse rate is going to be at reproducing the topography we have in the model. So you can see that most of these are actually really very poor. The green solid squares here, these represent springtime terrestrial dry bulb lapse rates, and they get much closer to our reference point than any of the other seasons, which is kind of encouraging, but they're still very poor. Now, the cluster that we have down below, circled there, these open squares represent seasons again, but these are wet bulb temperatures. Now, the difference between a wet bulb and a dry bulb is that a wet bulb thermometer has a moist wick around the bulb, which evaporates moisture to the air. So usually, particularly in dry air, a wet bulb temperature will be lower than a dry bulb temperature. Now, this is important because as a parcel of air moves across a land surface, it may change in elevation and its temperature may change, but also its moisture content changes. And this is the critical thing, that because moisture is changing across a complex, topographically complex landscape, you can't just look at temperature alone. You have to factor in moisture, and that's what a wet bulb does. So generally, dry bulb terrestrial lapse rates show very poor skill at reproducing a given landscape, but wet bulb terrestrial lapse rates are really quite good. Now, of course, that means that we then have to recalibrate all our proxies for giving us wet bulb. And so naturally, I would start by looking at clamp. And you will see here that this regression is the clamp regression for wet bulb as against the normal dry bulb temperatures that we're used to clamp providing us with. And you can see that it's a very good relationship. And when you think about it, a leaf is a bit like a wet bulb thermometer. It's losing moisture to the atmosphere all the time through transpiration. So a leaf temperature will be lower than the ambient dry bulb temperature of the air surrounding it. So it's no surprise that clamp codes very well for wet bulb. And so we can use clamp in terms of our wet bulb terrestrial lapse rates very straightforwardly. More complicated is recalibrating isotopes, in particular carbonate clumped isotope compositions for wet bulb. Very briefly, I should point out that carbonate clumped isotope composition is basically temperature dependent. I'm not going to go into the chemistry of it. If somebody wants to ask me at the end, I'm happy to. But basically, if you form a carbonate in a sediment, let's say a soil, the temperature of formation is reflected in what we call the clumped isotope composition. And if we measure this composition, we can then refer back to the temperature of formation. And so we can use clumped isotopes just like we might use leaves or nearest living relative methods for reconstructing past temperature. Now, of course, looking at paleoelevation, I've done that for a long time now using clamp and moist enthalpy. And I won't go into any great detail here, but again, the clamp moist enthalpy regression is very good. And moist enthalpy is a function of both temperature and humidity, one of the things we've just been talking about in relation to the wet bulb, dry bulb issue. And by using this simple formula here, the difference in elevation between 2 points is the moist enthalpy at the low elevation minus the moist enthalpy at the high elevation divided by the constant acceleration due to gravity. And this seems to be a fairly robust relationship. It can give you an overestimate of surface height in certain circumstances, and we are trying to understand more about how that should occur. And lastly, paleoaltimetry based on isotope fractionation, typically oxygen or hydrogen. Now, as a parcel of air rises, of course, it expands as the pressure decreases, it cools, and moisture condenses to give rise to rain. And because the heavy isotopes tend to rain out more than light isotopes, as you go up a mountainside, the rainfall contains progressively lighter ratios of the different elements you're looking at, typically oxygen or hydrogen. So that this works very well on the windward side of a mountain range like the Himalaya that has a prevailing wind direction. And most of the calibrations that have been used have been based on calibrations in such situations. The other thing that you need for isotope paleoaltimetry is that the isotope fractionation in rainfall needs to be captured and preserved in a carrier, typically a mineral or organic matter, and preserved through time without being altered diagenetically. And this has to be the case for both your high elevation and your low elevation or sea level datum. Unfortunately, as air travels over a topographically complex land surface, you get multiple evaporation and precipitation events, transpiration, etc. And all of this affects the isotopic ratios. So it's not quite so straightforward as this ideal model that we have here. What we're going to do now is, having got rid of all of the theories of that sort of approach, we're going to look at central Tibet. We're going to look along this Bangong-Nujiang suture, which provides the junction between the Changtang terrain and the Lhasa terrain. This is what it looks like in the field, as you would expect a plateau to look. In fact, plateau is not really this flat in most cases, but this is one of the sedimentary basins, the Lumpula Basin, I think this one is, in central Tibet, that accumulates, in some cases, 4 kilometers of Cenozoic sediments. Now, under compression from India, these sediments have been buckled over time, and here we have exposure of Eocene sediments. We're at 5 kilometers or nearly 5 kilometers elevation. So it's hard work digging. So we use a very large hammer, as you can see there. And what we've done is we've found in the last few years, particularly Su Tao's group at XTPG, has located a number of sites in this region, which have yielded wonderful assemblages of fossils. So this is one in the Bangor Basin, which is adjacent to the Lumpula, along the Bangong-Nujang suture. We have uranium lead date here for this horizon at 47 million years. So we're looking at the Middle Eocene, multiple layers or assemblages at these different sites in the section. And what we find is a very rich flora. And this flora contains many taxa, such as this one here, Lagocarpus, which is found not just in central Tibet, this illustration, but also in Messel and in the Green River of North America. So there's clearly quite a lot of interchange going on, and this immediately suggests, this diversity immediately suggests that we might be looking at a low elevation, certainly not something at 5 kilometers, even in the warmer Middle Eocene. This particular fruit here is Ailanthus, and it represents one of a very few of these taxa which have an affinity with India. Most of the taxa we find have an affinity with the rest of the Northern Hemisphere and not with India. And what we've been able to do is, of course, a clamp analysis with such a diversity of leaf forms. And what we find, first of all, is the climate was monsoonal. We have a wet, dry precipitation ratio of 6:1, which is monsoonal by anybody's standards. It's subtropical, mean annual temperature of 19 degrees. But note that the warm, the cold month mean temperature is 7 plus or minus 3.5. So the occasional light frost is not, it was distinctly possible back then. And it is humid. I've mentioned the wet-dry season ratio, but looking at the vapor pressure deficit, which we can get from the modern world CLIM calibration of CLAMP, shows us that the winter was the wettest. The lower the VPD value, the wetter it is, and summer was comparatively dry. So we're looking here at a winter wet system, not today's summer wet system. There we get that summarized. And when we do our moist enthalpy approach to looking at elevation, we get a paleo elevation of 1.5 plus or minus nearly a kilometer, but that's considerably lower than the present day elevation. So central Tibet in the Middle Eocene was low. And here's a reconstruction that we had done by Alex Boersma, showing what it might have looked like during a summer rain shower in central Tibet. And this fits a general sort of data that were produced before using beryllium isotopes by Hetzel's group. For the northern part of the Lhasa terrain, they suggested a 1 kilometer elevation. But this, I don't know why, it didn't really get much traction at the time. The pollen assemblages preserved in the 4 kilometer of valley sediments are a mix of tropical and of taxa, and some taxa are adapted to cooler environments, presumably occupying the slopes surrounding this Shangri-La type Tibetan valley. And if people don't understand the reference to Shangri-La, there was a novel published in the 1930s called Lost Horizon, which envisaged a hidden valley in Tibet, hosting a luxuriant forest surrounded by high mountains and cut off from the rest of the world. And the people living in this valley did not age, but if they left the valley, they suddenly assumed their real chronological age and died. So it's a nice story, but clearly back in the Eocene, we had something similar in terms of a luxuriant forest in central Tibet. Now, this is in marked contrast to the previous high and dry concept of Tibet in the Paleogene suggested by the isotopes. I'm not going to go into why the isotopes are wrong, but if people want to ask me at the end, I can. One of the most significant recent finds in the adjacent Lumpula Basin has been that of large palm fossils. And palms are particularly important here because, as we all know, their biology means that they tend to be rather frost sensitive, and they cannot, particularly as seedlings, tolerate deep frost for any length of time. Light frost is possible, not deep frost. So for a natural population to reproduce, you have to have essentially a frost-free system. And modern palms have a cold month mean low of 5.2 degrees Celsius as being the boundary at which natural populations can survive. And so we use that applied to these Eocene palm from central Tibet. We use that to try and estimate what the maximum height could be that that palm could have grown at in the ancient world. Now, when we first found it, we thought that it was in the Dingqing Formation, which would have meant that it was about 25 million years old. And using a Chattian climate model, we determined that it could not have lived more than 2.3 kilometers above sea level. However, subsequent uranium-lead dating has shown that it's actually 38 million years old and in the Nubal Formation, which underlies the Dingqing. Now, using a pre-Ebonian model, that raises the maximum elevation to 2.8 kilometers, and even so, that is still consistent with a deep valley between two highlands, the Gangdesi, which I introduced you to earlier on, and the Changtang mountain systems. And their elevations have been determined to be a roughly 4.5 kilometers in the Paleogene. So the Lumpula Basin Dayu biota, where the palm comes from, also contains a great diversity of woody dicots and also spiny plants, which is quite unusual. Now, these spiny plants, what can I say? The diversity which we discovered there is unusual, but maybe because we're reporting it. One of the problems is that I don't think that a lot of people, when they look at fossil plant assemblages, necessarily comment on the spiny plants that they might find there. But nevertheless, these spiny plants appear in central Tibet alongside a variety of large herbivores, the Brontotheridae, Hyracodontidae, and Paraceratheridae. I'm not very good at these, as well as giant rhinoceroses. So we have a paper which is now in review, which links the development of an open woodland landscape with typical spiny plants being predated by large herbivores in central Tibet around 38 million years ago, which is 20 million years before a similar change in the biota took place in Africa, which is often regarded as the poster child for the kind of savanna development that we're familiar with there. The assemblages also contain lots of insects. There's a water strider and fish and so on. And so it's quite a diverse ecosystem. Well, I've mentioned the looking at the using CLAMP to estimate paleo elevation, but we can also use clumped isotopes, and a paper which we have in review at the moment, which Xiaoyang Zhong at the Institute of Tibetan Plateau Research in Beijing, looks at clumped isotopes in carbonate nodules in the soils which are found in the central Tibetan basins. Now, one of the issues about carbonate nodule formation is that people in the past have tended to assume that the temperatures which we get either reflect the mean annual temperature or a temperature biased towards the warm season. The problem is that carbonate nodules need two things to form. One is they need warm conditions, and secondly, the soil must be drying, but not totally dry. Otherwise, the chemistry doesn't happen. So you have to have a soil that is drying, not one that is wetting, and also hasn't completely dried out. Well, when we look at our climate modeling for central Tibet using several different topography scenarios, we can look at a valley system or a plateau system for the Lutetian in the Eocene, and we can do the same thing for the Chattian in the Oligocene. We get, well, let's just focus on the valley systems to begin with. What we see is that we have, as was predicted by a clamp, this is the soil moisture in two different layers. So we see the moisture variation, but let's start with the precipitation. What we can see here is that the greatest precipitation is in the winter. So December, January is the highest precipitation. And then precipitation falls away to a very dry May, June, and they have a small amount of summer precipitation. So our two periods of drying of the soils are going to be earlier in the year or late summer. And we can look at the soil profiles to see where what the soil moisture is doing. And at the layer in the soil where we measure or sample the nodules, this deeper layer around 40 centimeters in the soil, we can see that the primary drying is taking place throughout the summer, and the summer rains don't penetrate to moisten that layer of soil. They evaporate before they get there. Similarly, a Chattian Tibetan scenario does the same. If we put into our model a plateau in the Eocene, we get a different precipitation regime, and our soil profiles are similarly altered. So getting to the point here, there are, in a Lutetian valley scenario, there are basically two possible periods where you could form your carbonate nodules, but the major one is going to be in the spring, early summer. As I said, we don't really get much going on in the late summer. So our temperatures are going to reflect temperatures in this part of the year, not the warm season and not the winter, but actually this temperature here. And we can do the same thing for all our other scenarios. And when we look at a Tibetan valley system for the Chattian, there are two equally possible periods of nodule formation, and the same with the plateau. What does all this mean? Well, basically, if you use the climate models to determine when your carbonates are forming and what those temperatures are, you can then convert those temperatures into wet bulb temperatures in the air. You can apply your wet bulb lapse rates, which I mentioned earlier, and this is what we get. 50 to 40 million years ago in central Tibet, the elevation comes out to about 1.7 plus or minus around 0.9 kilometers. Very similar to what we were getting from Clamp, in fact, almost identical. But by 29 million years, sometime in this window here, we start getting clumped isotopes that are suggesting elevations above 4 kilometers. We do not have plants in this interval. Sutao found one leaf this year. But other than that, there's no evidence of lush vegetation. And as we saw from the Dayu biota, we are already tending towards a drier, more open vegetation by 38 million. And by 29 million, early Oligocene, we're already at elevations which are approaching those of the modern. We've also applied clamp to the rise of the Himalaya, and this is what you can see. The Himalaya achieved most of their elevation after 23 million years, and of course they continue to grow today. Whereas the Gangdesi highland that they built against, that has remained high all the way through the Cenozoic, having first been built by the subduction of the Tethyan plate in advance of the arrival of India. So let's summarize the formation of Tibet. Back in the mid-Cretaceous, we have a Gangdesi retroarc basin, so going towards the north, on the right is the north. We've got the Neo-Tethys Ocean to the south. We're starting to build the Gangdesi here in the late Cretaceous. The mid-Cretaceous, all this is still marine. Around about 100 million years ago, the marine sedimentation ceases and this turns to dry land. By the Middle Eocene, around 47 million years, we have a valley system bounded by a now quite high Gangdesi and Tanggula mountain system. Tanggula is on the Changtang terrain. Bangong Nujang Suture runs up the middle. So this is around 4.5 kilometers, and here we're down at 1.5 to 1.7 kilometers with a subtropical monsoonal but winter wet vegetation occupying the valley. By the end of the Oligocene, this had risen to above 4 kilometers. And as we go into the Miocene, we have this situation where here are the Gangdesi, and now the Himalaya in the mid-Miocene are matching the height of the Gangdesi. Himalaya are clothed in vegetation, forest, as is the Gangdesi, and at the Tanggula, we're beginning to build the alpine ecosystems, but I'll go into that in a moment. And of course, the modern situation is where the Himalaya have an average elevation of 6 kilometers and going up to peaks of above 8. And we have a pronounced rain shadow to the north, and the whole of the Plateau region is comparatively dry, open steppe. The northern part of the Tibetan Plateau, as illustrated by the Chai Dam basin, here again, we've got lovely plants. We're talking about 31 million years ago now, and the clamp analysis suggests an elevation of 3.3 kilometers, which is indistinguishable from that of today. So by the early Oligocene, the northern part of the Tibetan region had also achieved its near modern elevations. Now we can reproduce that, and this is a nice piece of work done by Shufeng Li at XTBG, where working at Bristol, he built, as it were, reproducing the old idea of a progressive build of Tibet from south to north, just to test as a sensitivity experiment which parts of the plateau actually influence the development or the climate of East Asia. And what we find is that East Asia, that is most of mainland China today, remains dry, seasonally dry, I should point out, not totally dry. And coupled with this climate model is a biodiversity model that predicts the kind of vegetation and diversity that you would get under the climate generated by the model. Cutting a long story short, when we see the rise of the northern part of the Tibetan region, this effectively blocks cold, dry air from the north, allowing moist, warm air from the south to penetrate across China, and we get a transformation in the vegetation to a humid, warm ecosystem that we're used to today. What we can do is also look at the fossil records that we have from South China, moving away from the Tibetan Plateau now. And what we have is a nice package of different sites ranging through the Cenozoic. And what we find here, again, cutting a long story short, is that when we have radiometrically redated floras in this area, like Luhe and Wenshan, they were previously called Miocene because the floras looked modern. When we dated them using uranium lead in primary ashes found for the first time with these assemblages, we find they're not Miocene at all. They're actually early Oligocene or even late Eocene in age. They're roughly 20 million years older than everybody thought, based on the modern appearance of those assemblages. And what we now find is that all these assemblages are roughly the same age, that coincide with the building of this part of the Tibetan region, the Hengwan Mountains and down the Red River Fault system, which became active around the Eocene-Oligocene boundary. So all of these floras are very similar, including ones from North Vietnam. And it seems that the vegetation has remained very stable from at least the early Eocene, all the way through the Middle Eocene to present. So what we see today in this region, and here we've got some of the karst landscapes that are characteristic for much of that area, this is a very old flora. And that when we introduce moisture into this part of China as we go into the Neogene, we believe that the diversity of taxa that were in this long persisting diverse ecosystem here that moved into the moister warm area created by the development of the northern part of the plateau. I'm going to move now to the Hengwan Mountains, and this is eastern Tibet. So here we are, we've got the Markham and Gonjo Basin. There are some other basins in there too. But we went with Alexei and Ksenia to this Markham Basin in eastern Tibet. I'm just going to give you, this is a drone movie. You can see the truck moving along at the bottom here. There's a truck moving along the road. As we pan around, just to give you an idea of this landscape, absolutely gorgeous, but not a plateau, but still considered part of the plateau for our purposes. Now, within the Markham Basin, we have a large number of primary ashes that we can date radiometrically, in this case, argon-argon dates. So what we find that the multiple plant fossil assemblages span the Eocene-Oligocene boundary. This boundary itself is in there. And we see a marked change in the composition of the flora as we go from the Eocene to the Oligocene. Again, cutting a long story short, this translates into an elevation difference of roughly 1 kilometer as we go through this interval. And you can see we're talking about a million years or so difference in age. So quite a rapid uplift if all of this uplift is due to tectonics. Of course, as we go across the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, we also have a cooling. So there may not have been as much as 1 kilometer uplift in that interval. What we do see, though, is that by the Oligocene, we're already at 3.9 kilometers, which is roughly the present elevation. So we built the Hengwan Mountains by the early Oligocene. There you are, that's what it looks like today. And I put that there just to show how deeply incised these Hengron Mountains are. And a lot of the incision appears to have taken place in the Miocene, when we have an intensification of the monsoon, higher rainfall, more downcutting, etc. Now, one of the things that the Hengron Mountains are famous for is their biodiversity, which includes the alpine biome. Now, what we've done, of course, normally alpine plants do not get preserved in the fossil record. So what we've had to do is move to molecular phylogenetics to try and understand how old the alpine biome is in this region. And when we do that, what we find is that the earliest spike in situ speciation occurred in the Hengron Mountains. So here we have the Hengron Mountain spike. By comparison, the Himalaya, and you remember that the Himalaya were essentially built much later, around 20 million years and younger. We don't get a spike in Himalayan speciation until the Miocene. And on the plateau itself, generally speaking, what we have is colonization of the plateau, not in situ speciation. That really only begins again in the Miocene. So the plateau has inherited a lot of its taxa from surrounding regions, primarily the Hengron Mountains. The Himalaya similarly imported many taxa from pre-existing highlands. And here we should include the Gangdesi because that was highest, longest, but we don't have much left in terms of Gangdesi material to work with because because the Gangdesi today is dry. There's been a major change in the flora during the Neogene in the Gangdesi. But what this does point to is if you want to understand the evolution of biodiversity in this region, we need to find a lot more fossil sites within the ancient Gangdesi. So here is a summary showing the complicated growth of the Tibetan region. Gangdesi, based on a variety of different proxies. Always use multi-proxy approaches if you can. I would like to say CLAMP is perfect, but I know it's not. So it's really good when we get the multiple proxies coming together. And I would also say very exciting when the molecular phylogenetics is also supporting what we understand about the orogeny of this region based on other proxies. So the Gangdesi is long been high, long been above 4 kilometers. The Hengduan Mountains were the next to build to achieve a significant elevation, which coupled with global cooling, reduced the tree line across the Hengduan Mountains probably first and exposed large areas above the tree line where the alpine biome really came into its own. And then we have central Tibet rising in the late Eocene into the early Oligocene to form a plateau for the first time. Previously, we'd had this big central valley. Northern Tibet becomes high in the Oligocene, running into the Neogene, particularly the Neogene, things are happening. And the Himalaya come along, following in behind, where their major development is distinctly Neogene. Now, this, of course, has an impact on the monsoons, but it's very important to stress that monsoons have affected Asia for a very, very long time, going way back at least to the beginning of the Mesozoic. Basically, any time that parts of Asia have been within the seasonal migration of the intertropical convergence zone, they have been exposed to monsoon climates, and all that means for adaptations required by vegetation associated biota. So we can do modeling. Alex Farnsworth has looked and taken this back to the early Cretaceous. where we did have a very intense monsoon over East Asia. And then as we go through the into the late Cretaceous, East Asia becomes arid. This persists sometime into the Cenozoic, and then we start building the monsoon again, coinciding with cooling and development of the Tibetan orogeny, but entirely uncoupled from changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. Anybody wants to learn more, I recommend you go and look at that paper. We can also look at that tectonics, in particular, the movement of the Indian plate. Now, this started out down in Gondwana here at 150 million years, but as soon as it broke away, it traveled through the intertropical convergent zone monsoon belts, which lie either side of the equator. And so India's passage northwards saw it exposed to a changing monsoonal regime long before it collided with Eurasia. As we fragment Pangaea, we also fragment the intertropical convergent zone. But of course, by the time India arrives and builds the Tibetan region, it also amplifies the monsoon. And when we look at Indian megafossil floras, we look at them throughout the Paleogene. What we find is that they all have physiognomic fingerprints of an intertropical convergent zone type monsoon, such as we see in modern Indonesia and Australia. And you'll notice I've highlighted one called Tirap here. This is a late Oligocene flora from northeastern India. And the sort of orangey colored cloud here highlights where the intertropical convergent zone, Indonesia, Australia type monsoon is expressed in clamp physiognomic space today. And you can see that in different projections, Tirap actually falls outside of this cloud. And you can't really see it terribly well, but the brown squares here are all modern Indian vegetation exposed to the Indian or South Asian monsoon. And Tirap starts to appear in that cloud. So Tirap is an outlier. So by the time we get to the late Oligocene, we have begun to pick up the first fingerprints of a modern South Asian monsoon and a move away from the intertropical convergent type monsoon that we see in Indonesia and Australia today. So we believe that the modern South Asian monsoon starts to express itself in its modern form at the beginning of the Neogene. Now, I mentioned the Himalaya being a sort of a recent addition to the topography of the Tibetan region. Back in 1973, Zhu et al. Described some fossil oak leaves from a location on Mount Shishapangma. Shishapangma is above 8,000 meters today, and somewhere above 5,000 meters, they found some fossil oak leaves. These were assumed to be Pliocene, but there was no absolute dating on them. In fact, their location wasn't really well known. So in 2021, Sutao and colleagues went on an expedition to try and relocate this fossil assemblage. So hopefully you can just make out the sound, maybe not, but the Yaks are being whistled to, and they're moving up towards Mount Shishapangma, you can see here. And this is a sort of glacial terrain involved. Here they are at well above 5,000 meters, approaching 6,000 meters, doing geology. And this was a result. They managed to find the oak assemblage and have now collected material for much better age constraint on these. And my guess is, my bet is that these are early Miocene, not Pliocene. But if they're Pliocene, it tells us something very interesting about the evolution of the Himalaya and the floras associated with it. So that's the end of my talk, almost exactly an hour, amazing. So the conclusions. Plant fossils are transforming our understanding of the landscape across this region. Without plant fossils, we would not have had the first clues to the paleo-elevation changes that have taken place across the area. The isotopes were telling one thing, the plants were saying something very different. And now the isotopes are coming into line, as it were, because we understand more about particularly how clumped isotopes are formed and the complications associated with the so-called continental effect in how we use isotopic fractionation is becoming better understood. And with climate models, what we can do is actually we can track the fractionation that takes place as an air parcel traverses the landscape of the modern Tibet and paleo Tibet to actually predict what kind of isotope fractionation patterns we should see at a given place for a given time and evaluate the proxy and the models. What we now know is this landscape evolution was very complex, it wasn't simple, and it reveals deep geological processes. The rapid rise of central Tibet, for example, may well include thermal erosion of the mantle lithosphere, even if it doesn't apply to the whole of Tibet. And this complexity within a Paleogean Central Valley has got to be incorporated into any realistic climate modeling. Gone are the days when we can treat Tibet as a lump that rises and falls through time. For our modeling purposes, we have to try now and reconstruct the real past topography if we're going to understand the interactions between topography, climate, and biodiversity. This model iteration should lead to a much better understanding of monsoon dynamics through time at very high resolution. We are now moving from our existing models to spatial resolutions measured in the tens of kilometers instead of hundreds of kilometers. And of course, we can only do that if we've got a reasonable first stab at what the topography was. Fossil leaves can fingerprint monsoons and detect the evolution of modern monsoon dynamics. I gave you that example from India. We can do that across Asia. And the Asian monsoon is ancient. We need to appreciate that it's not something that appeared in the Miocene or even the Eocene. It has been dominating Asian biology for hundreds of millions of years. But the monsoon characteristics have changed with time, and that's what we need to understand. And that the modern exceptionally rich biodiversity of Asia is old. It first appeared in the Eocene. And because it's old, it's worth conserving as much as we can. It's incredibly important at times of rapid climate change like we have now, that this legacy that we've been bequeathed by time is conserved and appreciated. So thank you very much for your attention. This goes from me and all of the team involved. You can appreciate there's a lot of work gone into this. And in particular, our Tibetan friends, people who have supported us in the field with logistics, digging, all of those things that those of us who are used to living at sea level find difficult in the Tibetan terrain. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions and I can fill in any gaps you might have. It's been a gallop through a lot of information, but I hope it's given you a flavor of the kind of things that we get up to. Thank you.
Yeah. Dear Bob, so many thanks for your highly informative lecture and so artistically illustrated. Yeah, they're beautiful, except of in addition to being informative. And
thank you. Thank you.
Please, dear colleagues, write their questions in the chat and we will ask them to Bob.
So I'm not seeing my chat at the moment. I'm not quite sure why.
So there are no questions so far. You have time to find the chat.
May I ask?
Could you write it?
Sorry?
Could you write it except of pronounce? Because Bob prefers written question.
Written?
Yeah, written.
Well, Alexei, I understand. Yeah, you can go ahead and other questions. Give time for other people to write their questions. Okay. It's all right. I don't hear too well, so Alexei.
Yeah. If I understood correctly, Shangri-La Middle Eocene climate was winter wet and summer dry, right?
Yes.
So it was opposite to the modern monsoonal climate, which is winter dry and summer wet.
That's right.
And in this case, where was the intertropical convergence zone in this time in this area? So the climate was a sort of Mediterranean, I think, with wet winters and dry summers.
Yeah. This puzzled us a little bit to begin with, and then we looked at the winds, the wind directions in the climate models. You remember that the climate model was able to reproduce a winter wet scenario in terms of rainfall, just like we got from the clamp analysis using the VPD. And when we look at the winds, what we find is that there are winds penetrating up the valley from the west, from the Paratethys. So the moisture is basically coming in on the westerlies. In the summer, of course, we still have Asia being this large continental mass that's heating up and drawing in, developing a low pressure system and drawing in moist air from the south. It's coming up the Gangdesi, and as it rises, it's cooled, and we're getting a lot of convective rainfall on the mountain ridges. And when it passes over into the valley, it's comparatively dry air. Now, the only way I would qualify that slightly is that to the eastern end of the valley system, we do have moisture penetrating from what today is the Bay of Bengal. And the wind patterns are coming in during the summer from the south and curling around the edge of the Gangdesi, and so bringing a little bit of moisture in from that direction. But the moisture direction is absolutely critical if you're going to try and understand the isotopes, because if you want to measure isotope, if you want to measure elevation using isotope fractionation, you have to know what the fractionation was when the air parcel started its journey at sea level, i.e. what was the composition of the isotopic composition of the ocean surface waters, for example, or any land that it passed over on its way. So looking at the wind directions are really important. Up to now, everybody has assumed that most of the moisture sources for the Eocene central Tibet were from the south, as they are today. But I think we can now confidently say that's not the case. And so you have to look at the isotopic composition of somewhere like the Paratethys and not necessarily the Neotethys or the Tethys to try and understand that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Now, I've got I've got to scroll back. There's a whole list of talk. Right. Benjamin, you're welcome. Thank you very much. Izzy, Lagocarpus. Yes. How does it relate to, it certainly looks like a dipterocarp.
Yes.
The answer is we don't know. Sorry, not very helpful. Izzy, do you want to come on video? I can't see you. No. Anyway, Lagercarpus, yeah, it looks like it ought to be related to the dipterocarps. From India, we know that the first dipterocarps appear in the Maastrichtian, in the intertrappean beds, radiometrically dated to the pretty much the Cretaceous Paleocene boundary in the which is the, I'm trying to think of the lobe, the Mandla lobe in central India, and the first dipterocarp megafossils are Maastrichtian. But how Lagercarpus relates to that, I don't know. Tony Ferrello, oh, thank you. Natalia,
thank you very much.
oh, there you are. There you are.
Yeah, I'm here. So sorry, I thought that I'm muted in sort of general way, but I could unmute myself. So thank you very much for the explanation. And I was just wondering, because the fruit was very similar, but you know, it's just because then it would be another element from Gondwana or from south. But
I know,
yeah.
but it occurs in Messel, it occurs in
yeah, that's in Messel,
Green River.
Yeah.
Just a minute.
Yeah, that's it.
There you are.
Yeah, I know. Nice.
Just in case anybody wondered what we were talking about.
Thank you very much. Great talk.
Okay, thank you. Natalia, this oak leaf, was it deciduous or evergreen? Okay, it is supposed to be evergreen. I'm going to go back and look at it. Okay, it's a very tough, leathery leaf. And if you look at modern oaks that grow above 5,000 meters in the Himalaya, they are evergreen, but they, at least many of them are, not all of them, many of them are, and they're very small, tough, leathery leaves, just as we have here. It's going to be very interesting to know what the age of that is.
Thank you. And I wrote you one more question in the chat somewhere.
Okay.
Below.
When speaking about the origin and early evolution of angiosperms, we want to see molecular data. Yeah. Yes, but what we did was we didn't try and redate these as they are. The only redating that was done was in relation to the fossil material, i.e. trying to get the ages of the fossil material that we work on to be correct based on radiometrics. Now, some of the earlier work, Liu et al., which was a paper published, I think, in Nature, that argued for a great increase in diversity in the Miocene across China. They did constrain their phylogenies based on fossils, but when they published their work, they did not have the new dates for some of these fossil assemblages. So there is a possibility that those Miocene tie points, as it were, in their phylogeny are not Miocene at all, that they're earlier. And it needs the molecular phylogeneticists to go back and look and recalibrate their phylogenies. But in the alpine one, we have no fossils. So this is kind of just done raw, if you know what I mean. I mean,
Yes, thank you.
I would admit straight away, I am not a molecular phylogeneticist by any means. So I have to take on trust what my colleagues do. I just provided the geological context.
Thank you.
Okay, now I'm going back. Xiaoyan, that leaf looks like deciduous. Yeah, I'm going from the fact that it's, I'll go back to it. It's imposed its form on the sandstone. And so that implies that it's quite leathery and tough. And many of those leaves at that elevation in these alpine oak, and they're almost single species, say single woody species, pure oak forests that occur between 4,000 and 5,000 meters in the Hengduan Mountains and in parts of the Himalaya, but mostly Hengduan Mountains today. And it's, we don't know. I'm trying to think, it's a ring cup oak. What did I say it was originally named as? Just a minute. Quercus semicarpophyric heterobalanus. There we are. Yes. Was what it was originally identified as, if that helps.
Yeah, that. Yes, that section is deciduous, I think.
That's deciduous. Okay, all right. I don't think they found any fruits associated with it. So it's just at the moment, I think it's all based on leaf form. But if Su Tao is listening amongst everybody, then he can no doubt put me right on that one. Unfortunately, I was not, due to COVID and the fact that I'm quite antique these days, I did not go to Shishapangma, although I would very much like to have done. So, all right, I know the paper on leaves. Wu Xing Kai, evolution, this paper, Evolutionary History of the Angiosperm Flora of China, Liu et al. 2018, that's the one. Yeah. Okay, goodbye. Okay.
Any more questions? Well, one more from you again.
Now.
Look in the chat, Bob. One more question.
Okay. My question is about community diversity charts. What's the minimal interval bin for measuring diversity was? The edge effects were taken into account. Which slide are we talking about? Are we talking about the molecular phylogeny or?
Номер слайда, Жень.
Oh, I don't remember. I don't see.
The steam.
Which one? I'm just looking for it now.
Maybe 50. No. Okay, maybe
this one.
Oh yeah, yes.
Yeah. To be honest, I cannot remember. I know that there was some discussion when we published this in Science. It got lots of attention, as you can imagine. And I know that one group wrote and asked Richard Ree, who did a lot of this work, some technical issues that may have had something similar. It may have been a similar question. And Richard answered that to the extent that the editors decided that we were right and they would not publish the dialogue. But all I can say is that it's been tested by people writing in and commenting, and the methods that we used were shown to be robust. I know Richard reran the phylogeny with slightly different, let's call them assumptions, and basically the same result came out. So it does appear to be a robust result, but if that helps.
Thank you. Well, if nobody wants to ask anything else, well, or Alexei? No?
No. I think all of us, we have a lot of material and a lot of new material for
To
us
think about.
to think about. Yes, and we need more time to think about, and probably some more questions will appear later.
That's okay. I'm on email.
Yeah, this is what I mean.
Yeah, I've got a question here from Wu Sing Kai in Sun Yat-sen University. I heard that almost no conifers in some floras of Tibet. How to explain? Okay. Basically, the conifers were growing at elevation and not near the depositional basins. So, excuse me, we do get conifer pollen, but we get a lot of conifer pollen in the assemblages, which, as you know, is produced in large quantities by conifers, and many of the conifer pollen grains have got air sacs and things that increase their wind dispersal. So they're coming in from lots of different directions, mostly from higher elevations. In the Namling locality that we published on way back in 2003, that is in the ancient Gangdesi. And even there, the conifers, they're present as megafossils, but they're very rare. Mostly what we have are in the lower flora, they are deciduous, cool temperate taxa, ulmus, quercus, oh dear, we got maples, we got rhododendrons and that sort of thing. Very few conifers, and the conifers we do have tend to be rather small leaved conifers like cedrus type things. The upper assemblage, which is in Namling, which we did not publish on in 2003, but we collected from in 2018, that's almost a pure oak assemblage, which is very interesting. It's rather like the oak that you find in the Himalaya. So there's another story to be told there, which I have not touched on because it's very much work in progress. So I think the conifers are there, but they're just not near the depositional sites. And of course, we get conifers in the Luja Basin. They are growing there, and they're mostly sequoia, metasequoia type conifers and Pinaceae, and they show up in the biomarkers as well. I haven't mentioned biomarker work. That's a whole new and a whole other area that other people who are much more expert in chemistry can talk about.
Well, dear Bob, thank you once more for the amazing talk. You have broadened my horizon. Extraordinary today.
Now, if I had my way, I would take everybody on a trip to Tibet because it is such a beautiful place.
Yeah, so beautiful and so unusual.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Everybody. Right.